When Cheryl Ladd joined Charlie's Angels in 1977, she was stepping into a storm. Farrah Fawcett had just walked away from one of the biggest shows on television, and the public wasn't ready to let her go. The producers needed a replacement, fast. But no one expected the backlash to be this brutal. The press called Cheryl a copy, fans called her an intruder, and behind the camera, things were just as tense. Everyone had opinions. Some warned her that Jaclyn Smith wouldn't be welcoming, that she might be cold, guarded, territorial. Cheryl walked onto that set with one message ringing in her ears: watch your back. What happened next, though, was something she didn't see coming. Because it wasn't distance that Cheryl encountered, it was something else entirely. And what Jaclyn did behind the scenes, something no one ever saw, something Cheryl never talked about for decades, changed everything. She didn't speak about it publicly. Not in the moment. Not when the tabloids kept pushing the narrative that the Angels didn't get along. Not even when the series ended. She kept that story to herself. Until now. And what she finally admitted about Jaclyn Smith has left fans stunned. Cheryl Ladd didn't walk onto the Charlie's Angels set with confidence. She walked in with pressure. From the moment she was cast as Chris Monroe, the supposed younger sister of Farrah Fawcett's character, the weight of the show's entire future was quietly placed on her shoulders. The producers needed a hit. The network needed stability. And the fans? They didn't want a replacement at all. Farrah had become a national obsession. Her posters were everywhere. Her feathered hair had been copied in every beauty salon across the country. When she left after just one season, audiences were shocked. And when Cheryl was announced as her successor, public reaction wasn't kind. Letters poured into ABC. Critics questioned the casting. Tabloids predicted the show wouldn't survive without Farrah. Cheryl was thrust into the spotlight not as a new angel, but as the woman who wasn't Farrah. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere wasn't exactly warm. Cheryl later admitted she felt like an outsider walking into a well-established club. Jaclyn Smith and Kate Jackson had already bonded through an entire season together. They had inside jokes, familiar rhythms, and the kind of quiet trust that comes from long days on set. Cheryl, meanwhile, was still figuring out where to stand. She tried to keep things light. She smiled, followed directions, and worked hard to prove herself. But she felt the tension. Some of it came from the crew. Some from producers who didn't want to risk another ego clash like the one they'd just had with Farrah. And some, Cheryl believed at the time, came from Jaclyn herself. No one said it outright, but the warnings were there. People told Cheryl to keep her distance. They said Jaclyn was nice in interviews, but different behind closed doors. That she had fought hard to protect her role on the show and wasn't about to let a new angel outshine her. Cheryl didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore how careful everyone was when the cameras weren't rolling. In her own words, Cheryl described that time as walking on eggshells. Every scene felt like a test. Every pause between takes held the potential for silence or side glances. And while no one was openly unkind, the distance was clear. Still, Cheryl showed up every day. She learned her lines. She hit her marks. She tried not to take the whispers personally. But in quiet moments, she wondered if the rumors were true, if Jaclyn really had decided from the start to keep her at arm's length. That question hung over the set for weeks. And then, something happened that shifted everything. The first month on set felt like a long audition. Cheryl Ladd was still learning how to fit into the rhythm of a show that had already found its stride. The scenes looked effortless on television. But behind the scenes, the energy was different. Every movement was calculated. Every line read felt like a performance not just for the audience, but for the people behind the camera and beside her on set. Jaclyn Smith wasn't unfriendly, but she wasn't warm either. At least, not at first. She was professional, on time, polished, poised. And maybe that's what made it harder for Cheryl to read her. Jaclyn gave no obvious signs of rejection, but she also didn't give much away. And that silence, those long pauses in the makeup trailer or those moments between takes when no one spoke, started to fill with doubt. Cheryl tried not to take it personally. She reminded herself that joining an already successful show was never going to be easy. And Jaclyn, as the face of Charlie's Angels, had more to lose than anyone. She had stayed when Farrah walked. She had carried the show through network negotiations, sponsor meetings, and relentless media attention. She was the one constant. And now, a new angel had arrived, fresh-faced, untested, and expected to revive the magic. That kind of pressure could make anyone wary. The turning point came during a long night shoot on location. It was one of those chaotic production days where everything ran late, temperatures dropped, and tempers frayed. Cheryl had been running lines with one of the crew, trying to memorize a difficult scene that was rewritten last minute. It wasn't going well. She kept stumbling. And as the hours dragged on, her frustration started to show. Jaclyn was sitting nearby in her chair, going over her own lines. She didn't say anything for a while, just watched. And then, without being asked, she stood up, walked over, and quietly said, "Come on, let's do it together." That was the moment Cheryl never forgot. It wasn't what Jaclyn said, it was how she said it. Calm, kind, no ego, no cameras watching. Just two actresses in the middle of a cold night, and one of them reaching out when the other was struggling. They ran the lines over and over, with Jaclyn patiently correcting Cheryl's cues, helping her find the rhythm, giving her the confidence that hadn't been there an hour before. And when the director finally called for rehearsal, Cheryl nailed it. She didn't say anything to Jaclyn afterward. She wasn't sure how to express what it meant. But from that night forward, something shifted. The looks between them weren't cold anymore. The silences weren't heavy. And while the show continued to be demanding, Cheryl felt something she hadn't felt since arriving, like maybe she wasn't alone. Still, she didn't forget the warnings. She didn't forget the doubts that had haunted her those first few weeks. And even as a real friendship began to grow, that early tension never fully disappeared from her memory. Because for Cheryl, it marked the moment where everything could have gone wrong. And Jaclyn made a choice that changed that outcome. It happened during one of the most difficult shoots of Cheryl's early run. The storyline required her to be front and center, leading an episode that would either prove her place as an angel or confirm the critics were right. The director was under pressure to make it perfect. The crew was tired, and Cheryl could feel the weight of the entire production pressing down on her shoulders. The scenes were fast-paced, with stunts and emotional beats woven together. For the first time, Cheryl wasn't just filling a spot in the background, she was carrying the narrative. And everyone knew it. She barely slept the night before. Her lines were memorized, but her confidence was brittle. Every time the camera rolled, something went wrong. A missed cue, a fumbled prop, a hesitation that wasn't there in rehearsal. The tension was building, and the crew began to lose patience. Whispers started to spread around the set, "Too green, not ready, not Farrah." Cheryl heard them. Not the words exactly, but the tone, the looks, the slow head shakes when she missed another take. She could feel herself shrinking. All the warnings came rushing back. That Jaclyn might turn, that she might protect the show before she protected her co-star. But that's not what happened. During a break, as Cheryl stood frozen near the monitors, watching her own mistakes on playback, someone stepped in front of her. It was Jaclyn, and her voice was calm, but sharp. "She's doing fine," Jaclyn said to the director, loud enough for others to hear. "She just needs space to breathe. Let her breathe." It was the first time anyone had spoken up for Cheryl on that set, and it came from the one person she had been told to fear. The room went quiet. No one expected Jaclyn to intervene, not like that, not publicly. But she didn't stop there. She walked over to Cheryl, took her by the arm, and led her away from the crowd. There was no big speech, no pep talk, just a moment of kindness, a reset. After that, things changed. Not immediately, and not in the headlines, but on set, the temperature shifted. The crew backed off. The director adjusted his approach. And Cheryl, for the first time, felt like she had backup, not from the producers, not from the fans, but from the one woman whose approval mattered more than she'd realized. Jaclyn didn't do it for credit. She didn't mention it later. In fact, Cheryl never spoke publicly about that moment until years later. But it stayed with her. Because in that one instant, Jaclyn made it clear that Cheryl wasn't just another replacement. She was part of the team, and she deserved to be treated that way. Cheryl later said that moment was when she started to believe she belonged. That she wasn't just pretending to be an angel, she was one. But the truth is, she might not have made it through that episode without Jaclyn. And the story doesn't end there. Because what Cheryl learned later about Jaclyn's decision that day and what she'd been risking behind the scenes made her realize just how much had been on the line. The moment Jaclyn stood up for her changed everything. But Cheryl never talked about it publicly. Not during the show's run, not during the reunion interviews, not even when journalists asked about behind-the-scenes drama or the supposed feuds between the angels. She always kept it light, polished, professional. And that silence wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Because in the world of television in the late 1970s, women didn't often get credit for lifting each other up. And Cheryl feared that if she spoke about what Jaclyn had done, how she had protected her in front of the crew, it might be twisted. Headlines might say she needed saving, that she couldn't handle the pressure. Or worse, that Jaclyn was pulling rank behind the scenes. So Cheryl tucked the memory away. Years passed, the show ended, everyone moved on to new projects, but the memory of that day never faded. It would come back to Cheryl at odd moments during auditions, press tours, or quiet nights when she wondered how different her life might have been if Jaclyn hadn't stepped in. It wasn't just the kindness that stayed with her, it was the risk. Because what Cheryl didn't know at the time but learned much later was that Jaclyn had been warned too. Producers had advised her to be cautious around Cheryl, to stay neutral, to avoid getting involved in any tension that might arise between the new cast member and the old team. There was concern that backing Cheryl too strongly might create division, or give the impression that Jaclyn was choosing sides in a show that was already under pressure. But Jaclyn ignored that advice. She chose her conscience over her career, and Cheryl never forgot it. She described it years later, not as a grand act of heroism, but as a quiet decision that changed the entire dynamic of the show. She didn't have to do that, Cheryl said. She could have looked the other way. Everyone else did. But she didn't. And still, even then, she didn't tell the whole story. It wasn't until decades later, long after Charlie's Angels had been rewatched, rebooted, and reimagined, that Cheryl finally allowed herself to speak openly about that day. About what Jaclyn had done and what it had meant. Not to generate buzz and not to rewrite the show's history, but to honor the truth that had stayed with her the longest. That, in an industry built on image, Jaclyn Smith's real strength had nothing to do with lighting or costume or fan polls. It was in what she did when no one was looking. But there was one more thing Cheryl never said until recently. One last detail that revealed just how personal that moment had become. And once she shared it, even fans who thought they knew the whole story were left stunned. Cheryl never spoke publicly about that moment during the show's original run. She didn't bring it up during press tours or cast reunions, and she didn't include it in interviews when people asked about tensions or friendships behind the scenes. But those memories stayed with her, tucked away as something too personal to offer up to the media. Over the years, her connection with Jaclyn Smith deepened not through grand public gestures, but through the quiet consistency of two women who had been through something few others could understand. They weren't just former co-stars, they had weathered the pressure of replacing a national icon, survived the relentless scrutiny of the press, and held their ground through 5 seasons of fame and exhaustion. And yet, even in private, Cheryl held back from saying one thing aloud. That what Jaclyn did for her in those early days didn't just change her experience on the show, it may have changed the entire course of her career. She didn't realize it at the time. But looking back, she came to see that Jaclyn's choice to step in, to speak up, and to offer support when everyone else stayed silent, gave her something she didn't know she needed: permission to believe she belonged. In later years, when Cheryl finally reflected on it in interviews, she framed it not as a dramatic turning point, but as a small, human moment that meant everything. A quiet gesture that didn't need applause, because its impact was already lasting. And while she never put it in dramatic terms, those closest to her have said it was something she never forgot. She had been warned about Jaclyn, told to be cautious, advised to keep her distance. But Jaclyn proved them all wrong. When fans look back at Charlie's Angels, they remember the style, the stunts, the iconic opening credits. They remember Farrah's hair and the perfect poses and the glamorous world those three women seemed to live in. But behind all of it were real people navigating pressure, judgment, and a level of public scrutiny few could understand. Cheryl Ladd was brought in to save a show that wasn't sure it could survive. She faced skepticism from the audience, quiet tension on set, and the weight of trying to live up to someone else's legacy. What she didn't expect was that the person she was warned about would be the one to steady her. Jaclyn Smith didn't have to intervene. No one expected her to. But she did. And the impact of that decision, quiet, unpublicized, and entirely unforced, was something Cheryl carried with her for decades. They were never loud about their friendship. There were no grand displays, no tabloid stories of secret alliances. But for Cheryl, the truth of what happened on those early days never left her. It wasn't about one scene or one episode. It was about being seen when it mattered most. And sometimes, the most powerful moments in television history aren't the ones caught on camera. They're the ones no one saw at all. For more emotional stories, check out this video.